Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Committee of the Whole for Monday, October 19, 2020. I'd like to call this meeting to order, and before we go into the rest of the agenda, I would just like to acknowledge that we are meeting the traditional territory of the Wasanich people. Council, the agenda's in front of you. Are there any additions or changes at all?
Move approval as presented.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor? Motion carries. Thank you. And next we have the approval of minutes for the regular Committee of the Whole of October 5th, 2020.
Move the minutes be approved.
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, call the question. All in favor? Motion carries. Thank you. And next we have from Administration and Finance, 6A, Property Tax Distribution Policy, presentation by Andrew Hissick, Director of Corporate Services, and a report October 13, 2020. Mr. Hissick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've distributed by email a copy of tonight's presentation for those who might be attending remotely, and the three people in the chambers here have a copy already. If anyone at home would like one printed off, please let me know. And it will be also posted on the town's website, perhaps on the agenda page, so anyone watching later can follow along. You have a fairly extensive report in front of you as well. I'm sorry about all the information. It's a bit of a shotgun approach. I'm hitting you all up with a bunch of information that will supplement tonight with the presentation. And it's all geared toward a fairly comprehensive review of our tax distribution policy. Those who have been on council before have probably seen this portions of this presentation at least 2 or 3 times, but we hope that this is the time when we actually get through it and set some policy direction going forward. Having said that, I think looking at the tax distribution policy is something that every council should look at, so it's something that should be reviewed every 4-year term of council, unless we're really satisfied with it. But even then, it's good to have a look and just confirm that we are, in fact, happy with the way it's working. I'm going to start off tonight with a general review of some property tax concepts, and just as a bit of a primer as to everything that goes into the property tax process, from the assessment to the rate setting, and how it affects the various classes of property. Talk a little bit about taxes for other governments, how rate setting works, a lot of discussion about tax multiples, what they are, how they are or are not the ideal way to look at our tax distribution. We'll look at a brief comparison with others to see where we stand and to see if that has any bearing on our direction. And finally, we'll look at a few questions and issues around the review itself. Any committee member who has questions, you can ask throughout or ask at the end. It's really up to you. And a lot of what I'm presenting, it's similar to the report. It's probably too much information, but I'd rather err on the side of too much than not enough. And based on what I hear from council tonight, we'll decide what gets presented at our next session and when that'll be. So depending on the volume and complexity of questions that committee has tonight, I'm anticipating that we'll come back here in about 4 weeks to do this, the second phase of this review. So general concepts, all property owners pay a share of operating the municipality based on the value of their property. So you can think of it as a large strata corporation where everyone pays a share, and here the share is determined by the value of your property, and the annual property reassessments as completed by BC Assessment, they're a redistribution of the tax burden from one year to the next. So even within a property class like residential, some residential properties will be worth more than they were the previous year, while others will be worth less, and that represents a small redistribution of the burden. And we all know that municipal taxes make up only a part of the tax bill, but our rates and our multiples also impact the regional rates and also the library taxes. We know that non-residential properties pay taxes at a higher rate than residential. And by non-residential, I mean business properties, light industrial, recreational, utilities, and we have one farm property for what it's worth. And the concept of non-residential paying at a higher rate, that's a province-wide norm. Just how much higher really varies throughout the province, but there are no instances of a one-to-one relationship in business taxes to residential. So the higher rates paid by non-residential classes may be viewed as a subsidy to the residential tax base. It allows municipalities to provide a higher level of service to residents than the residents themselves would be willing to otherwise pay for. So while I mentioned that higher rates for non-residential are a norm, the level of subsidy does vary greatly across the province. One caveat, though, is that residents pay taxes in after-tax dollars, whereas non-residential pays in before tax, so they can deduct it from their income tax. So let's say $1,000 in taxes is $700 for a business after they deduct it from their income taxes. Property assessments make up the first phase of our taxation. It's a valuation done by an independent Crown Corporation, BC Assessment. By having one Crown Corporation perform this valuation across the province, it creates efficiencies and consistency throughout the province. And it provides an arm's length valuation, so we're not the ones setting the value of the property and also setting the tax rate. It eliminates that perception of conflict. So as mentioned, the annual valuation is a redistribution of the tax burden. So even with no tax increase, some properties will pay more than they did the previous year, while others will pay less, even if there is no general increase. And how much more or less depends on their change in value as opposed to the average. It supports the concept of ad valorem tax, which is a tax based on the value of your property. This differs from consumption taxes like PST and GST, or income taxes, which, as we know, are based on how much you make. So all three work differently, and we sometimes have to resist the urge to tie property taxation into income-based taxation, because that's already covered in a separate taxation. So properties are grouped into different property classes. Class 1 is residential, Class 5 is light industrial, Class 6 is business other, Class 8 is recreation nonprofit, but really all the nonprofit are exempted. So for all intents and purposes, in Sydney, Class 8 means the marinas and associated businesses. And there are different tax rates for each class of property. So BC Assessment sets the property value, the town sets the applicable rate, and both entities have been reinforcing for many years now that an increase in assessed value does not mean an increase in taxes. Because if everything goes up just because of market values, we lower our tax rates so that everything comes out even. So the only changes really happen through that redistribution from one property to another. I must apologize. There's a table in the staff report that looks very much like the one here, but the information is incorrect. So this table updates the information for the percentage of assessments coming from each class of property for 2019 and 2020, as well as the percentage of taxes collected. But what this table illustrates is that while residential properties make up roughly 87% of our assessment base, they only pay 73% of property taxes. Whereas commercial properties, they make up only 11% of the assessment base, but they pay roughly twice that in terms of taxation. And the charts below, it's a graphical representation of what I just said. As mentioned, we, on the tax notice, collect taxes from many other levels of government. The province for school taxes, BC Assessment, Victoria Regional Transit, Municipal Finance, Regional Hospital District, and there's a brief description here for what those things cover. In addition, there's also the Capital Regional District levy, the Vancouver Island Regional Library levy, and those two, as well as the municipal taxes, they make up something that I like to call local service taxes. So those three will be the focus of the illustrations I'm going to provide tonight. So we're not just focusing, when we're looking at what others are doing in the region, we're not just focusing on municipal, we're also looking at regional district as well as library. And I'll go into more detail as to why later in the presentation. So in terms of all those taxes for other governments, only one of those taxes are we fully responsible for, and that's the municipal, obviously. That's where we develop the budget, we set the tax rate, and we control the multiple. We also set the rates for regional library, regional district, and regional hospital, but only two of those do we control the multiple. Regional hospital, while we do set the rate, it's based on a multiple provided by the province. So if you look in the third column there, control multiples, the top three where it says yes for municipal, regional, and library, those are the ones, the rates that we set impact all of those, and that's why part of the reason why I'm grouping them into our discussion tonight. So where do our tax dollars go? This chart shows for the average commercial property in 2019, 60% of the tax dollars go to what I call local services, so municipal, regional, and library. And the reason why I'm using 2019 is because there was a one-time reduction in 2020 done by the province, a smaller one by the municipality. But if we were to look at 2020, this chart would look dramatically different because of the one-time decrease in provincial school taxes. But I don't believe that represents the normal going forward. So I'm going back to the last normal year for this illustration. How we set our tax rates is relatively simple. So we look at, and once again I'm using 2019 for illustrative purposes because what we did this year was a bit different. But in a typical year we get our new assessment values by property class, and from that we remove the non-market change, which essentially is growth in the tax base, and then we have a net 2019 assessment. And we look at how much revenues we raised last year, and we set a new base tax rate so that we bring in exactly the same amount of revenue based on the new assessed values. And only to that do we apply the general tax increase across the board. So in 2019, it was higher than normal at 3.93%. And that's how the new rates are set. And then we put the non-market valuation back in because that's essentially new revenue for us. And then we also set the rate for CRD and hospital and library. Moving on to what we call tax multiples, and it's important to understand what these are. The ratio between a non-residential class and the residential is called the tax multiple. So, for example, in 2020, the Class 6 tax rate was 5.33 per 1,000 of assessed value, and the Class 1 rate was 2.18 per 1,000 of assessed value. So you put 5.33 over 2.18 is a ratio or multiple of 2.4468. So a Class 6 property, a business, will pay taxes at roughly 2.5 times a residential property. To take that a little further, for a property assessed at $500,000, and those are hard to come by these days, a residential property would pay $1,090 in municipal taxes, whereas if that same property valued at $500,000 were Class 6, it would pay just over $2,650. It's important to also note that a residential property is eligible for a homeowner grant reduction if and 95% of properties qualify. But also, again, that non-residential pays in pre-income tax dollars. So the one thing I'd like to reinforce is that neither tax multiples nor tax rates should be considered in isolation. You need to look at the full picture. So the rates are adjusted annually to reflect the assessment changes. If assessments go up, the rate goes down so that we generate the same amount of taxes from properties with a higher average value. And if the assessments for different classes of property change at different rates, that will impact the multiple. Even if no change in taxes paid, the multiple will go up or down. So it's not a shift in town tax policy, it's just the way the rate setting works, and I'll provide an example of this in a moment. But it's got to be factored into any future policy. So if we choose to focus only on the multiple, let's say we choose to aim for a multiple of 2.0 for business, that's only a one-year solution because the following year, the assessments will change at different rates. So keeping it at 2.0 is somewhat artificial, and it won't be the same tax increase applied across the board anymore. So here's an illustration of what I mean by not focusing on the multiple. So in this illustration, the first line of the table, tax year 2016. In our example, a residential property and a business property are both assessed at $500,000. So let's say the tax rate for residential is 2.0. The tax rate for the business property is 4.0. And you'll see in the very right-hand column, that's a multiple of 2.0. So the rate is twice what it is for residential for a commercial property. So 1 year hence, you go into 2017, and the average residential property has increased in value by 10%. So it's gone up from 500 to 550,000. So we lower our tax rate from 2 to 1.81 to generate the same 1,000 in taxes. Whereas a Class 6 property, instead of going up by 10%, it only increased by 5% on average. So once again, we adjust the tax rate. It goes down, but not quite to the same degree as it does for Class 1. Nevertheless, that same commercial property still pays the same 2,000 in taxes they did the year before. However, the multiple in the final column has now gone from 2 to 2.095. So same tax, different multiple. I won't go through the other two lines, but it's the same principle. So in 2018, you're looking at a much larger residential increase for the average residential property of 30%, and only a 5% for Class 6. And this is similar to what's been happening over the last few years in the region for residential properties. So in 2018, once again, the average house pays $1,000, the average business pays $2,000, but the multiple is now closer to 2.6, with no increase in the taxes paid. You get the picture. And at the bottom of the slide, it just illustrates where actual changes in the average assessment have been for the last 6 years. So you'll see in 2016 and 17, we had fairly substantial increases for the average residential property, up to 20% in 2018, whereas for business it was much smaller. So it's only because of that difference in the relative value between the classes that our multiple has gone up. And that's the important aspect of focusing on the multiple for policy setting. Just to reinforce that on the tax bill, not only do we collect for all these entities, but we use 6 different multiples on the tax bill. So the town, the one we set, impacts only 3 of those taxes. And then the regional hospital multiple is set by the province, the school tax multiple, transit, BC assessment, and MFA. They're all set by the province, and we have to follow it. This table goes back to 2019 again because 2020 would have skewed the results. But the key points from the above is the town multiples for classes 5 and 6, the ones that we control, tend to be lower than those set by the province. These are just some pretty colorful charts I like to include every now and then, just to show how the multiples have changed over the last 13 years or so. So the blue flat line is obviously residential. The green and red lines, which diverge from 2019 through 2016, represent business and light industry. We had a long-standing policy where those rates were equal, and then temporarily they got out of alignment. Then we slowly brought them back into alignment, and under current policy, they are set to remain equal. And the purple line, if you can see that level of detail, is the recreation multiple. And the table down below shows what the values are for the graph. Same information, but going back 10 more years. It just shows that if you go back far enough, you'll see some larger spikes. It's been fairly stable over the last 13 years, but the last 23, there were definitely some larger spikes, especially in the recreation side, back to 2004 and 5. And this just graphs the town's commercial tax rates versus multiples over the last 23 years or so. The only thing you'll really get out of this is that the multiple is a little more stable than the rate, because the rate's very much dependent on where the assessments go up and down. And this graph shows the municipal versus the provincial school tax multiples. So the colorful line down below shows the multiple that we're responsible for, whereas the gray line up above is the provincial school tax multiple. So up until 2020, we were always below. But because of the one-time, I'm assuming one-time reduction in school taxes in 2020, they dipped below our line. Moving on to a brief comparison with other municipalities. Now I should preface this by saying that nothing I'm saying here tonight is meant to be a critique of any of our neighbors. It's just we do things a certain way for certain reasons. We don't fully understand their motivations for setting their rates and multiples the way they do. All I'm showing here is the reality as I see it of where things stand, having made it as close to apples as possible. So there are challenges in comparing our taxes because not everyone provides the same services, and even if they do, maybe not to the same level or to the same quality. And not everyone includes all services in the municipal rate. For example, library, recreation, policing. Some municipalities include the library levy within the municipal rate. We don't, we break it out. So for purposes of this illustration, I'm combining it. And also, for a larger jurisdiction like Saanich, Victoria, they have their own recreation service, so that will be included in the municipal rate, whereas for us, we pay that on the regional district levy. Panorama Recreation is included in the regional levy. So for that reason, I'm bringing it all into the comparison and calling it local service taxes to illustrate a common basket of goods. And again, I'm calling that local government service taxes. I mean, there's still some variation, but to the largest extent possible, those have been smoothed out by focusing on those three rates. And I've left Metchosin and Highlands out because they're small. This table, it represents 2019 tax rates within the region. And it's sorted in terms of the Class 1, the residential rate. So it shows that in 2019, the town's residential rate was the second lowest within the region. Only North Saanich had a lower rate. And again, this is municipal, regional, and library. I'm showing classes 5, 6, and 8 here as well, but the sorting is done according to Class 1 for this table. So it shows the average across the 11 municipalities is just over 3.1, and we're below that average. Same table, but for 2020, Sydney has gone from second overall to third as far as residential tax rates go. So now we're focusing on Class 1 residential rates for 2019 and 2020. So this shows the first blue line is the 2019 rate, and the green line is the 2020 rate. Sydney is shown in red, and the average is shown in yellow. So this just reinforces that table we looked at 2 slides back, so that we are second lowest within the region for residential rates and third in 2020. Now, same information but for Class 6 business, showing that Sydney is third lowest, or was in 2019. Moving on to multiples, which is the ratio of Class 6 rate to Class 1. In 2019, our Class 6 multiple was 2.9, which placed us, on the lower end of the range, below the average, but not quite among the lowest. Whereas 2020, we were really the only ones who reduced the Class 6 rate. We did that by 10%. That moves us down to third lowest within the region for the Class 6. I'm showing Class 5 as well, which is light industrial. For the town, our rates are equalized between those two classes, but they aren't the same across the region. The most common thing is for Class 5 to be a little higher than Class 6, but you'll see that there are others who choose to standardize those rates. And finally, Class 8 recreation, the marinas. Again, showing the 2 years. We're on the lower end of the range again and well below average. So in the report, I gave an illustration of what it would look like to lower, if we had lowered the Class 6 multiple to 2.0 in 2020 instead of 2.446. It would have created an additional tax burden of $421,000, which likely would have gone to the residential class, and that would have led to a tax increase equivalent to 3.59%, or an extra $97 for the year for the average residence, $8 a month. And that figure includes CRD and VRL. So it seems like a fairly big increase, but that's arguable. Obviously, you don't want to impact the average residence that much all at once, but $8 a month to bring some level of additional equity, it might be deemed appropriate. But if it's deemed too big, it could be phased in over a few years if council decides to even go there. But again, focusing on the multiple might not be the answer for the reasons I illustrated earlier. Excuse me. Just very briefly, I'll touch on some historical town tax policies. Until 1984, the province used to set ratios for municipalities that we had to follow, the multiples. But at that point, they turned that over to municipalities. The town used to continue to use provincial class multiples through the 1990 year, and then we took over doing our own. Since 1991, we've applied the tax increase, net of the non-market, the new construction, equally to all classes, subject to some very minor adjustments from time to time. So essentially, we've been doing the same thing for close to 30 years now. From 2006 to 2008, the town chose to manually increase residential to bring it back to a higher percentage of the tax burden, closer to 70%. And that had the impact of reducing non-residential and decreasing the multiples. So that was a conscious choice by the council of the day to bring down the multiples, give some relief to commercial. And that's potentially what we're looking to do here. And then I mentioned earlier that for a long time we equalized classes 5 and 6. They got out of alignment, but now they're back, and as per policy, they're meant to stay in alignment. So our tax rate setting practices, they typically smooth out the impact of market growth in the tax base. So assessments go up, our rate goes down, property pays the same as the previous year, subject to our budgetary needs and our general tax increase. Now the non-market change, the growth in the tax base, that really is the only thing that changes the distribution of taxes from one class to the other. So if you get a large spurt in your residential growth, then that will lead to class 1 taking on a bigger tax burden than the other classes. One caveat is that BC assessment has not always been consistent in what they consider market versus non-market, and that's something for really for me to pay attention to and encourage them to pay more attention. Since 2009, the community charter has required that the town's tax policy statement be included in its financial plan bylaw, and we've done that. It's just a way to make us more accountable and encourage us to consider our policies on an annual basis. So our existing tax policies, as outlined in our financial plan bylaw, Council will strive to set tax rates and ratios to maintain stability between property classes, factoring in non-market growth. Essentially, that says keep it status quo, and the only thing that'll change the distribution is non-market. Our policy also says that classes 5 and 6 shall not exceed 3.0 in terms of a multiple, and that classes 5 and 6 must be the same. Now, that second bullet point where the multiple cannot exceed 3.0, you'll recall from a slide a couple of minutes ago that in 2019 we were at 2.09, 2.905. So another year of high growth in residential and lower growth in commercial could have potentially put us at that policy limit, even without increasing the taxes for the average business. So it's not really the kind of robust policy I'm looking for. Finally, the fourth bullet point in our policy is that the distribution of taxes across the various classes shall be reviewed in the current term of council, and that's what we're doing now. So whatever decision we come to through this policy review, it'll be articulated next year in our financial plan bylaw. So as outlined in the staff report, there are two basic policy options. One is to set and maintain a stable percentage of taxes from each class of property, and this is by far the most common rate-setting method used province-wide. The other policy option is to set and maintain a constant tax multiple. That's hardly ever used province-wide, but it is in fairly limited cases. So we use number one, tax increases are applied equally to all classes each year. And non-market growth is the only thing that varies the percentages from year to year. But it's done very, very gradually to the tune of, roughly 1% or so per year. So I've thrown a lot of information at you, and there's going to be a lot more, but in terms of some questions we might want to answer, whether it be tonight or through our ongoing review, is, first of all, based on what we know about where we stand regionally, are we satisfied where we stand in terms of the commercial tax burden? If we are, then we should consider policy wording that'll keep us there, better wording than we currently have in our policy. If we're not satisfied and we want to go lower, question then is, how much lower do we want to go? What's our target if we have one? Are we going to look at a multiple, or are we going to look at a tying in percentage of taxes to percentage of assessment? One question I would like to answer sooner rather than later, a commitment I would hope to seek from council, is, are we willing to commit to using the 2020 rates and multiples as our starting point for 2021? So we looked at it as potentially a one-year tax cut of 10%, but if we keep it there, we're part of the way to answering what some consider our problem, which is the multiple needs to come down. If we go back to the 2.9 again, it just increases our challenge. So we could choose to use 2020 rates and multiples as our starting point. That way we've already built in part of the solution, and then we just have to find a way to make up that $300,000 in lost tax revenue. But even now, if we make that up across the board, at least Class 6 will be starting from a lower starting point. Another question we might want to throw around is, do we wait and see what happens with COVID and the economy before we set the ultimate policy direction? At this point, I'm anticipating that COVID might carry on through the 2021 taxation year, at least through part of it. And beyond that, the economic recovery is likely to go on for several years. Do we think that that recovery will impact non-residential properties more than residential? It's something for council to consider. So in terms of what that means and for long-term policy, we'll have to wait and see. But if we do choose to use 2020 as a starting point, maybe we have to worry about point number 3 a little less. Finally, another question, since we're getting back into tax policy, is should Class 8 be included in this review? As briefly mentioned in the report, the previous council considered that question briefly, and they decided that no, marinas aren't necessarily the same as any other business, so we're not going to include them in the review. But if this council chooses to do so, whether it be to bring them closer to the classes 5 and 6, or some other methodology to bring them a little closer, that's for you to decide. And if you do choose to review Class 8, a lot more information will be brought forward to illustrate some of the issues. If we are going to review Class 8, it's only fair that we inform the marina owners. We've got 2 major marinas in town that pick up roughly 87% of the total Class 8 taxes, so they should be interested parties in this, and they might want to make a submission. In terms of where I see this going next is I'm going to consider council questions and potential resolutions that may or may not come out of this initial meeting and determine the timing of the next meeting. Right now, I think it'll be 4 weeks hence, so mid-November. And based on, I'm not going to be by any means pressuring council to come up with any resolutions right now. There's a lot to take in. There will be a lot more if there's questions to be asked and answered tonight, so don't feel pressured to make any resolutions, but based on what discussion does ensue, I'll consider that and put together resources for the next meeting. And as mentioned, if we do get into Class 8, we'll notify the marina owners, and that decision doesn't have to be made tonight. That could be made at our next meeting, or potentially not at all. So with that, I open it up to any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hissick. Council, do we have any questions for Mr. Hissick? Mayor McNeil-Smith?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Hissick, for the excellent presentation. Thank you for the detailed 9-page staff report, which we've had for several days, and cover important material. I guess some of the questions are for clarification. I might start off by saying at this stage, and certainly open to listening to my colleagues around the table this evening, but with the while there was considerable information provided in the staff report, which we've had time to consider, just receiving the presentation this evening, I would feel more comfortable making resolutions at a subsequent meeting. And I might be jumping the gun here, and I'm not making a resolution. This is not to make a resolution, but to ask the timing of our next committee of the whole meeting is it not in 2 weeks, or is it in 3 weeks?
It's in 2 weeks.
It's in 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So personally, and again, subject to listening to colleagues, I would be willing to continue the conversation. And if any members of council request additional information, that could come forward at that time. But apart from that, I'd just like to make some clarifications to try and confirm my understanding. So, in the staff report, you made very clear early on, and again, it was through your presentation this evening, that really there is a choice in terms of setting and maintaining a stable percentage of taxes from each class of property. And that's what the town of Sydney has been doing for 30 years. And in your staff report, you also indicated all or virtually all other municipalities in the region have been doing the same, or are currently doing the same.
My understanding, and from my discussions with my cohorts, it is the common method is to try and allocate the taxes equally, although from time to time other jurisdictions do decide to take a stab at reducing the difference between the classes. I know North Saanich has made a conscious effort over the last few years, but because they have one of the largest commercial multiples, to slowly bring that closer into alignment.
So appreciating that, there is the method we've been using for quite some time now and others are using, and I think I understand that much better after this evening's presentation. Or there is setting and maintaining a constant multiple, and we know some of the challenges associated with that. You made reference back, I think it was to the 2006 or to 2008 period, whereby that council of the day chose to actually consider the multiple and make an adjustment in 1 or 2 tax years at that time, which in effect at that time brought the multiple down, but basically you then continued on with a percentage of taxes for each class. But the benefit of doing that is what it did is it brought the multiple down, and even though the multiple changes every year by at least a little bit, it would have the effect in general of keeping the multiple a little lower. Is that?
That is the result. I'm a little rusty in what exactly they decided, but my recollection is that they were aiming at a percentage of taxes from Class 1 as opposed to a specific multiple, but that in turn brought the multiple down.
Okay, so let me use the 2019 example then,
Sure.
and I'm going to go back in the slides, and I marked it somewhere here. So on the slide, impacts of lowering business multiple. And the first line is lowering Class 6 multiple to 2 times residential.
Okay.
So if on a one-off basis, we decided to change the rates such that the multiple in that particular year was 2 times, we saw that if we had done that in 2019, the effect would have been to increase taxes by $97 per year for the residents for Class 1.
That's correct, but this illustration is for 2020, just for clarity.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
It's just a current example.
That's right.
So, so then when I go back a slide or two, and I'm not asking you to go back, I'm just going to read from it. It said that, well, I had the 2019 Class 6 multiple was, for Sydney, was 2.9. In 2020, it was 2.4, but we know that that was a special case. So in lowering the multiple from 2.9 or down to 2 in one particular year, it has that impact, that magnitude of impact on shifting to the residential. What you would do is, but to carry it further, so if you did that in a given year, you would then go back to percentage of taxes to classes, and in general, your multiple would have a better chance of being closer to 2 in the future.
Yes, and in theory, but whatever decision we make, I'm going to have to give some thought to how to articulate that in a policy that will achieve what we're trying to achieve.
Okay.
So, yeah, it'll have to be an iterative process going forward. Let's just decide where we want to go, and then I'll do the wording.
Well, in effect, what it's doing is, I mean, in terms of policy, what it's doing is it's definitely shifting the burden from Class 6, some burden from Class 6 to Class 1. And presumably if you do that and then you maintain this, then go back to maintaining rates, you're going to maintain that slight shift in burden.
That's correct. If we choose to pick a target multiple, whether it be 2 or something else, what that'll mean, though, is that the tax increase will not be applied equally because the classes will grow at different rates per each year. So just keeping that multiple constant or even relatively constant will require a bit of a shift in the percentage of tax increase applied to the different classes.
Okay, so I mean, one thought I would leave with my colleagues is that I'm starting to think along those lines, but actually, given the significance of $97 in a year that had a 0% tax increase across the board, I would actually perhaps do it over 3 years, to gradually shift that, but it would have a lasting impact in terms of the share of the burden. I do have some other questions, but I'll leave it at that for now and turn to my colleagues. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Hisnick?
Sorry, Madam Chair. Can I just add one more thing to complete that thought? Is in 2020, by initiating that 10% reduction to Class 6, we essentially took us halfway to 2.0 with no impact on residential because we funded that reduction from accumulated surplus. But it's not the kind of thing we can do every year going forward. That's why if we were to do it again, it would likely have an impact on other classes, especially residential.
Thank you. Mayor McNeil-Smith?
If I could have another thank you. And sorry, I did mean to touch on acknowledging that what we did last year actually would get us partway there, and we could repeat that. Sorry, I just lost my but the way we did it last year was we reduced the tax to the commercial by going to our surplus, whereas if we were to do it this year again, the suggestion is we would actually shift that slight burden to residential, is it?
That really is the only realistic way going forward because of the magnitude of the lost revenue and the fact that we've used up a lot of our excess surplus this year.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Garnett?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Following up on that question, given what we did last year, if we were just to do the 10% reduction for business, but we didn't do the 0% to residential, how would that have impacted the bottom line? If you know that offhand.
Well, the reducing the tax increase from the projected 1.79 to 0, it wasn't a huge savings to residential, but if we hadn't done that, it would have been, instead of 97, probably would have been 120 or so.
I'm just trying to think in terms of relation of having to go 300,000 into surplus. If there would be an offset, so we wouldn't have to go that, you see where I'm following? We wouldn't have to go that far into surplus to cover the reduction from business?
Sure. Well, I mean, based on the questioning I'm hearing right now, I can provide illustrations for the next time we get together that give an example of what this might look like.
Okay.
So just looking at where we would have been if we had just rolled back the general tax increase to 0 from 1.79 without the additional 10% reduction in commercial, our multiple would have been 2.7-ish. So down from 2.9 to 2.7 with no intervention from the town. So we essentially brought it down by another 0.25.
Thank you, Mr. Hisnick. Councillor Wainwright?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I don't actually have any questions, but I did want to bring forward a couple of ideas, largely for Andrew's benefit, so he can think about them before a future meeting, but also a couple of things for my colleagues. So in the financial plan, you mentioned the current tax policy is stated there. And thinking about what you had on that slide, the only thing that you factored in to the policy was the non-market growth. I think there's one other factor that you should be thinking of including, and that is the conversion from one class to another. So to give you an example, if we have, for example, a large hotel that switches to a residential development, it's going to flip from one class to another. And it's not simply a non-market growth change happening. It's actually, you know, a property moving from one assessment class to another. So that's something just maybe a tweak for you to think about including in a future iteration of that. The other thing that you mentioned, that there were basically two approaches to this tax policy, and I guess I'm thinking of what might be a third approach, and it's something kind of in between the two, and that would be that we have some target multiples that we're interested in trying to maintain, but we allow the current approach to be applied, which means that the multiples are going to tend to drift based on the market growth. And what we do as part of the tax rate setting is we include an adjustment to the multiple, and the magnitude of that adjustment is proportional to the difference between the multiple and the target rate. So what will happen is that every year there will be a tendency to push it back towards the target that we're trying to maintain. And the farther it deviates from the target, the more it will tend to get pushed back. So every year we will be making a progressive adjustment that's formula based that tends to push it back towards the target. And the benefit I see in that is that if it's a formula-based approach, there's no sort of politics involved in figuring out what the rate adjustment is going to be in a particular year. So that's one you might want to think about, and I'd be happy to chat with you separately about that. Anyway, thank you, Madam Chair. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Councillor Wainwright. Any more questions from Council? Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. Mr. Hizzett, can you just go over, I guess, the Class 8 and the Class 6, Class 5 distinction? So I'm guessing just the way you've written it here in the report, so Class 8 is just basically just the water and the land. And then so if they've built like the dock itself, any business that may be located on that dock, you know, the refueling station or, you know, whatever they're getting for mortgage fees by having that space, that's all in the Class 6, and then it's just.
That's correct. The Class 8 represents the land or water under the improvements, and the improvements are considered Class 6. So even within the marina, you're just shifting from one class to another, which tends to lower the impact. But by shifting taxes, I think I need to think this one through a little bit to make it a clear answer. But yes, you're right. There is a combination of classes 6 and 8. So some of the extra burden on 8 would be enjoyed by their Class 6 portion, except Class 6 is such a large property class that that benefit from increasing Class 8 is spread out over such a larger tax base, if that makes any sense.
It was just the wording that said, that the previous council had considered adjusting Class 8 to match Class 6, which would, I guess, be similar to the way we already tax, residential properties, where my land and my house have a different valuation, but the same flat rate is applied to both of them. So as the land values have been skyrocketing, but the value of my house has been decreasing, my taxes still go up. And so I'm looking at the Class 8 and Class 6, and it looks like that's the way that, it's split out so that there's a value to the water and the land itself, and then the value of the stuff on top of it. And there's that phrase saying, they decided not to adjust the Class A rate because there was very little income from it. And so that's where I was trying to figure out what income could be derived from Class 8 alone without having a Class 6 improvement put on top of it.
Good question.
You stumped our CFO.
Honestly, to me, it makes a difference if it's land or a water lot, because you can do more on a land. You can't truly develop a water lot to the same degree you could a land lot. So it escapes me a little bit why BC Assessment does it in that fashion, but I'm not an expert in the Assessment Act, and they are.
Well, thanks. I guess that would be for if it comes up and seems to be relevant for our future discussions, you can try to include more discussion about that. Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have Mayor McNeil Smith?
Thank you. I just through the chair to Councillor Wainwright.
Sorry, we can't hear.
Sorry, through the chair to Councillor Wainwright. A question with regards to the formula as you're seeing it. It would take an adjustment the first year, and then the form to go to X, and then a formula afterwards to try to maintain X. Is that the idea?
Actually, the formula adjustment would be applied every year.
Even the first year?
Even the first year. The thing is that because the adjustment is proportional to the difference between the current multiple and the target multiple, if there is actually no difference, like if the current multiple is the target multiple, then there is no adjustment to be made.
Right, yeah.
So the formula can actually be applied literally every year. It's just that the magnitude of the adjustment will be in proportion to how far off the target multiple the current multiple is.
Right, okay, fair enough. You could set the formula, but if the formula was to go from 2.9 to 2.0 in the first year, that you would have to consider the magnitude of that first year.
My thought is that the magnitude would not be 100% of the difference.
Oh, okay.
It would be some kind of function that is a modest adjustment if there's a modest difference, and tends to be a larger adjustment if it's a larger difference. But still, it shouldn't be so large that you would bring the multiple back to the target in 2 years. Mm-hmm. Maybe we plan the magnitude as such that that it'll bring the multiple back to where it's supposed to be in 4 years. And if there's a tendency to keep pushing it away, it'll obviously take it longer.
Yeah.
If something happens that tends to move it back quicker, then it'll adjust quicker. But if we can come up with a formula approach, there's no politics to it, and it's something staff can apply routinely. The challenge is just it will likely be a bit more complicated to explain to people.
Thank you, and through the chair to Councillor Wainwright, that is an appeal to myself as well, in that instead of adjusting the multiple this year and then seeing what happens with the tax rates and then coming back in another year and trying to decide on bringing it back, that formula has that advantage of taking that politics out as it or deciding if and when to how often to come back to it. And the second is thank you also for bringing up the shift to classes, and it was a question, and you've Mr. Hissick has already agreed to bring information, but could you comment in general, Mr. Hissick, if there have been noticeable shifts between 1 and 6 in recent years? I mean, when you think of the number of condos, for example, but for example, there is airport lands in Sydney that have new development on it or new improvements that constitute new assessment. But are you able to comment at this time, or I'm happy to wait till a future meeting?
I will provide more information for the next meeting, but if you look at the corrected table in tonight's presentation, where the taxes collected from residential went from essentially 71 to 73, that's a factor of largely the adjustment we made. In a typical year, that shift would be much smaller, and it's likely in the range of 1% or less, and that's a factor of the non-market. If that was the question, as I understand it.
No.
But
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bear. Mr. Hissick, you had another comment?
I just want to clarify that we can do all kinds of creative methods for setting tax rates, but council needs to know that what might be lost here is my ability to tell you at budget time what the impact on the average residence will be. Because right now it's easy. If we're looking at all these after the fact, like after budget approval adjustments to the rate, I can only guess at what the impact on the average residence and average business will be. And that could be okay, as long as you know that's going to be the fallout of doing this.
Okay, thank you for that point. Any further questions from council? Seeing none, then thank you very much, Mr. Hissick. Oh, sorry. Oh, Councillor Rentoul, sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Not a question, but a comment. And I know Mr. Hissick had noted he was, looking not necessarily this evening, but at some point to get towards addressing some specific questions to help along with this process. One of which is, are we willing to commit to using 2020 rates and multiples as our starting point for 2021? I think I'm comfortable with that in that, it leads to his next question around COVID. We're not seeing the environment having settled or reached resolution yet. And so I think for some of the same reasons, we looked to make some changes to taxation for this year, likely apply to next year. So my comment to Mr. Hissick would be that, I'm comfortable, committing to use 2020 rates and multiples as our starting point for 2021. And I'll just touch briefly on the Class 8. I think Councillor Duncan had a very important, clarification there. And what comes to my mind is that it takes very large tracts of land and or water lease to support the operations, for example, of a marina. And as a result, I don't know that it would be, appropriate to revisit and look to, shift certainly an increase in that area. And so I'm comfortable with leaving the Class 8 discussion out of it from that perspective. I'll leave my comments there, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Rentoul. Councillor Garnett?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, it's more of a comment as well, but I concur with Councillor Rentoul in terms of I could be comfortable with the 2020 rates as a starting point as well. And I guess my concern is around the pandemic aspect of it as well, and centering around how much of our local economy survives on tourism and the airport industry, which they're saying are a long time to recover. And then the other aspect tied into that is the fact that our borders are still closed and to America, which is such a big, important part of our local economy. And it's likely to be that way from what I'm hearing and everything I heard today for, quite some time. There's no indication of when that's going to stop. So for those reasons alone, I concur with Councillor Rintoul's starting point. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. And Councillor O'Keefe.
Thanks. Just a comment. I just really appreciate the information. This presentation really is useful in starting to wrap our heads around this issue. So thank you to Mr. Hisick for that. We'll need some more time to percolate on it further. But initial thoughts, it seems like a good idea to stick with the 2020 rates. And now that I understand the issue with the Class 8 a bit more, my initial thought is I agree with Councillor Rintoul that I'm inclined to not consider any further change to the class rate. So just a couple of my initial comments, and might have more questions next time once we've had a chance to ponder the information further. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And I would echo those comments as well, and thank you, Mr. Hisick, for your good explanation and intense work to present this. It's a complex subject, and a lot of us are amateurs at this part of sort of thing, and really appreciate your patience and clarity in this. So with that, do we have any further questions? Mr. Hisick, yes.
Thank you for your kind words, Madam Chair. Now, I haven't heard a lot of detailed questions requiring a lot of work on my behalf, so I'd be happy to bring this back on November 2nd, just to ensure that not too much time passes in between consideration of this matter. So then 2 weeks hence, Council will have more of a chance to digest and come up with additional questions. So if that's acceptable, then that's what I'll plan for.
Thank you, and I think that would probably work well for Council. So if we, Mayor McNeil-Smith?
So I would move receipt of the staff report and that we consider it at our next Committee of the Whole meeting.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any further comments? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Motion carries. Thank you very much. And moving on, we have 9A, a summary of Phase 1 of the Official Community Plan Update Project, presentation by Corey Newcomb, Senior Manager of Long Range Planning. Welcome, Mr. Newcomb.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. A presentation on tax policy is a tough act to follow, but I shall do my best to be brief and interesting. So as the committee is aware, we began our OCP review update project in April of this year, so it's been about 6 months since we began. We're just honing in on the end of Phase 1 of the project, and so I thought it an appropriate time to bring an update forward. So tonight I'll just cover a quick summary of what we've been working on in Phase 1 at the staff and consultant level. Some of the information we've heard from the small bit of stakeholder engagement we did in Phase 1, and then cover some of the next steps. So we kicked off the project in April 2020 in the midst of a global pandemic, which was an interesting start to the project, but we were pretty quickly online with Zoom and other online tools, and so we started off meeting with the project consultant fairly quickly and moving forward with the initial steps of the work. Primary initial steps, we're meeting with Modus, sort of setting out the initial steps of the project and doing some stakeholder mapping. So a group of staff met with Modus, and we had some discussions about who the town might want to reach out through in the process, and we brought some of these groups forward to council, who approved a number of letters to stakeholders, First Nations and others, to sort of bring them up to date on where we were with the project, that we were starting the project, and inviting them to provide early comment. Around the same time, Council established an OCP Review Advisory Committee, which met for the first time in May of 2020. Following that, throughout the summer months, June and July, Modus, the project consultant, held some initial stakeholder interviews, which I'll discuss in a little bit. And Modus also brought forward their first deliverable for the project, which was the detailed work plan and the community engagement plan, which was finalized in July. So a quick look at the project timeline on the right-hand side of the slide there. Phase 1, the initiation and background review phase, we're a little bit behind, I would say, a few weeks. Just working on the final deliverable for Phase 1 now, and we've just started into the initial steps of Phase 2 as well. So the biggest part of Phase 1 is a bit of a hidden process, mostly with staff and the consultant, just doing background research, looking at what the town has now in terms of a policy structure, bylaws that might contribute to the OCP review. Taking some of that information, Modus has done a socioeconomic analysis of Sydney. Some sub-consultants of Modus have mapped some characteristics of the town in terms of transportation, walkability, location of services, environmental aspects, and so forth. Modus held a workshop with council, as you know, in July to get some initial thoughts from council on where the project might go, and also undertook a gap analysis on the current OCP to look at which policies may need to be updated, and whether or not we're missing any significant aspects in terms of an up-to-date OCP. As well, they undertook a review of relevant bylaws, policies, and plans that the town has. Incorporating those into the OCP will be a big part of the project. And all this is working towards the final deliverable of Phase 1, which is the background and recommendations report, of which we've just received the initial draft. Some of the communication and outreach work we undertook in Phase 1 was to finalize the communications and engagement strategy. Along with that, there was a social media strategy and some infographics, a sample of which I'll have in a slide to come. The OCP Review Advisory Committee was established. We've had 3 meetings to date. We've undertaken some First Nations engagement. We did send some letters out to all the bands on the peninsula, and I'm happy to report that we have our first meeting with Wasatch Leadership Council this Thursday, to hopefully bring them into the project and get them more involved. And as you can see from the slides and the logo, the project logo on the first slide, we've done some project branding as well, just to bring a bit of a unique look to the project overall. So one of the interesting things that came out of the background research in Phase 1 was some work on climate emissions that Modus's sub-consultant Integral did. Very happily, the CRD had just completed an inventory of greenhouse gas emissions in the region and broken down by municipality right as we started this project. So it's a huge benefit to the town. One of the tasks that Integral was going to do was undertake an inventory, but we have one ready to go thanks to the CRD. And so Integral can now take that and do some extra analysis and scenario building for further on in the project. Along with that, there's going to be a best practice review of climate mitigation and adaptation policies, and that will come as well. But yeah, some definitely positive trends in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in the 10-year period from 2008 to 2018. So overall emissions are down by 9%, and some fairly significant drops in sector-specific areas as well. Biggest is in waste emissions, which obviously is from the collection of organics, but a double-digit decrease in transportation as well, which is a positive sign. Unfortunately, it's not quite to the extent of our OCP target, which is 15% below 2007 levels by the year 2020, so probably about 5% below that. But nonetheless, I think it's a positive sign, and it'll give us a lot of basis to develop more precise targets and model some scenarios that are very achievable going forward. So, as I mentioned, Modus undertook some stakeholder interviews early in the process, and staff and council as well met with Modus and provided them with some direction setting and information as well. So some of the key points we heard from the internal work that Modus did with staff and council was that we're looking for a high level of communication and community participation in the project. Needed to build an understanding amongst the community and the public about what the planning process is and how OCPs work. Looking to engage those people that we seldom hear from, the silent majority, so to speak, and have the OCP reflect strongly what residents' views for the future are. Articulate a clear vision on what the community wants and have that vision in the OCP, and also provide a clear pathway to implementing that vision as well. So the OCP Review Advisory Committee, as I mentioned, they've met 3 times and they've provided some very valuable and welcome advice along the way. So the first meeting was really just sort of to get things started, provided some project background to them, some timelines, and a bit of information on what the committee's role in the project would be in terms of providing advice and guidance to staff as we move along, and also to council when requested. The second meeting was a bit of a crash course in planning and OCPs, just to get them up to speed on the sort of structural issues that they'd be facing throughout the project. And then the third meeting was to get them to review the work plan and community engagement plan. So they provided very valuable feedback on all of that stuff. And for anyone interested in watching or following along with their work, the minutes and the video of the meetings are available on the town's website. And we do have another meeting scheduled for October 27th to go over some of the next steps in the project. So in terms of the stakeholder interviews that Modus undertook, there was 11 representatives of local community groups, some business organizations, environmental organizations, housing organizations, so a broad cross-section of the community. And these individuals helped Modus identify some of the key challenges and opportunities that these groups are facing or seeing in the community currently. And it's also a chance to sort of reach out to those groups, make them aware of the project, build some trust for having them be part of the project going forward, and keeping them sort of in the loop as the project progresses. So keep in mind that some of these groups are focused on very specific areas, obviously. But some of the things we heard were that it's important to support downtown and the businesses downtown, small-scale retail, keeping the downtown a vital area. The need to maintain community character, so the small-town character of Sydney, and balancing that with growth and development in the community. The need to protect the environment, address climate change, enhance and protect natural assets in the community, and looking at demographics and change in the community in terms of the people living here, and the need to reach out and support younger households, families, and everyone in the community, I guess. There was also a number of comments about looking more broadly beyond Sydney's borders and how Sydney interacts with its neighbors and across the region. Sydney does have a regional or a sub-regional role in Greater Victoria, and obviously there's things like transportation that cross borders that we need to look at closely, as well as ecological connections. And of course, housing and affordability is continuing to be a major concern for many people in the community. So the final phase, or sorry, the final deliverable from phase 1 of the project is the background and recommendations report. And as I said, we've just received a draft, and this will be coming forward to council next week. And what it's intended to do is sort of provide a baseline for moving forward with the project. So identifying what our current policy framework is, whether there's gaps or opportunities in that framework. It's not intended to sort of set directions at this point. It's just sort of something to say, here we are, here's the makeup we have, and here's some things that might need to be considered going forward. So looking forward to get council's feedback on that next week. And with that, we'll tie up phase 1 and move fully into phase 2. So in terms of next steps, I guess just to cover the early part of phase 2 that we've already undertaken, we had our public project launch event at the Mary Winspear Centre, as council is aware, on September 26th. And we held a virtual open house for 2 weeks online. In-person attendance at that event was probably a little bit low compared to what we've seen at this type of event in the past. So we had approximately 70 people attend, as well as council and the OCP Review Advisory Committee. And we had 130 online responses. So typically I would say we'd cross the 100-person barrier at the in-person event pre-COVID. But overall we had 100 responses in the communications strategy in terms of feedback from this event. So we've doubled that. So overall, I think, given the circumstances, it was a success. In retrospect, I think it was probably a good idea to hold off on that beginning of community engagement until the fall. I think people were still somewhat cautious in terms of attending an in-person event, but definitely a higher comfort level than I think we would have seen in the summer. So one thing we've started just before the public project launch event was an interactive idea map on the town's project page on our website. So it's www.sydney.ca/OCP. And anyone in the community at any time can go in there, drop an idea on the map, and staff are making an attempt to sort of prompt further thought on those ideas, provide sort of a conversation starter and moderating function for that idea map. So we've gotten quite a few comments already on that. And in terms of the next sort of big event for the project, we're doing the Urban Design Charrette later in November or early December of 2020, of this year. And that's really an opportunity to dive into some of the more physical aspects of the OCP, so looking at land use, neighborhood character, things like that. And there's a number of other community engagement events that will be happening from now up until the end of phase 2 in February, March of 2021. And we will definitely make every effort to get the word of those events out as much as possible. It's certainly been a bit of a challenge with COVID to get people aware. We've run a number of full-page ads in the Peninsula News Review for the project launch event, I think with mixed results. Some people have mentioned that they're not getting the Peninsula News Review these days, so we're trying very hard with social media. As council knows, I've been out in the community a few times now to spread the word of the project, and some of the OCP Review Advisory Committee members have assisted with that as well, going door to door in the downtown. So I think it's going to be an ongoing battle going forward, trying to get the word out about the project, reach those people that we typically don't reach, but we will keep doing our best to do that. And I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Mine.
Oh, there we are. Okay, got it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Newcomb. Do we have any questions from council? Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just in terms of the struggles or the ongoing battle of getting people involved, So the PNR, social media, are we looking at approaching like the Sydney Parents Advisory Committee to get information out to them, to other very, organizations, I don't know, where there's kids, daycare centers, the schools, other community groups that we can tap into? Have we thought of that, or going there, or?
Through the chair to Councillor O'Keefe. We have gone there primarily via social media. I would say it was marginally successful. We had a few sort of responses. I mean, I think we do need to do more sort of non-traditional stuff like that. And we're working on it.
Yeah. Oh, okay, great. Thank you.
If I can, just to hook on to that, what about venue selection? Does that make a difference? I mean, if we go to Mary Winspear, that has a certain demographic that is very familiar, will show up there. Any consideration to looking at venues that might be more attractive to families of the younger demographic?
So what we're planning right now is to essentially tag on to various events and or places. So council may have seen the social media post for myself out on Beacon Avenue with a small table and sort of prompting a question from the public. So we'll be setting up that table at, for example, the town's upcoming Arbor Tree Celebration Day, just to sort of get people who may be interested in trees, for example, but not community planning, and sort of just to, if we can grab a couple of minutes of their attention at certain times, then we'll try to do that. Places like potentially soccer fields on the weekend, or just sort of random spots throughout town. Looking at the skate park potentially, trying to get the youth interested. I'm a bit of a tall order, I think, but I think the key is as part of the sort of ambassador program, staff are going to need to go out into the community as much as possible. It's very difficult to expect people to respond to ads or social media posts and get the kind of response we're hoping for. So,
yeah, thank you. I agree with that. Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do appreciate that sign that I see every time I drive into Sydney. I think that's you can't miss it. So I mean, I think that's a good use. Have we approached any local businesses in terms of putting posters or such up in various venues like grocery stores and areas that people might frequent?
As I mentioned, the OCP Review Advisory Committee went door to door with a number of businesses in the downtown several weeks ago. We've got some postcards that we've been handing out. We do have a poster that is up on the town's notice boards, but yeah, certainly we could try to get it into Starbucks or something like that. We also have two, in addition to the sign reader board you mentioned at the entrance to town, we've got two sandwich board signs, and we'll be putting those out on Beacon Avenue and other places around town as well to sort of get that walk by traffic.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Under normal circumstances, it's difficult, but given what we're dealing with, it's a challenge. So I appreciate your efforts, and we have to think outside the box, because if this is the time for thinking outside the box in a big way. So thanks very much, Corey.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll go to Councillor Duncan first, and then Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Newcomb, could we repurpose the large sign that was used for the Rest Haven Park kind of information that was put up there for the playground, and maybe kind of piggyback an OCP, info thing onto the Tree Appreciation Day that's coming up? I mean, that got a lot of people out there, and I overheard quite a lot of the families that were coming after that park opened saying that, they'd gone and filled out the survey and everything because they saw that sign every day, like right in their neighborhood. And they're all saying they had no idea this many families even lived in Sydney. There were so many people who were managing to come. So that might be a really good new hub because everyone is really into the park improvements that are going on there. And they were all talking about the tree planting that was coming up and how they talked to Brian about it. So I think this might be something we can actually get that demographic that Councillor O'Keefe is looking for, provided, it doesn't create an extra cost burden. But if we can repurpose as much as we can and kind of piggyback onto an existing thing that we're going to be doing, maybe that might be something we can get that demographic.
Yeah, thank you. Through the chair to Councillor Duncan. So what we're working on right now is something similar. It's I guess a very large poster. It'll have a QR code that you can scan and it'll take you to the ideas page on the website. We haven't decided exact locations, but precisely, I mean, somewhere that's high traffic that people are interested in, we'll try to place them in those locations. Right now, the challenge is we need to get something that's weather resistant. So we're looking at sort of some vinyl signage or something like that we can have out for extended periods rather than having to bring something in when the weather comes.
Thank you. Councillor Duncan or O'Keefe?
Thank you. Oops.
You've just muted yourself.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I'm going backwards with that. Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it was Rathdown Park, I think, that Councillor Duncan was referring to. And actually, I was going to comment on that as well, because, man, the number of families and kids up there these days, it's just at the top of my street. It's great to see. So I think that her idea of a sign there is good. The other thing I was wondering was about ways that council can support this as well. I mean, many of us are out and about quite a bit, and I had a group of people over this past week for the Meet Your Street program, and I mentioned the OCP, but most of them don't know what an OCP is. I told them a little bit about it. Go to the town's website, and there's a place there you can provide feedback. But I think it's sometimes hard to navigate on the town's website. And also, if I'm thinking of, you mentioned you had some postcards. If you have a postcard or a handout that I could hand out to people, or council members could say, hand out to people we meet about, this is what the OCP is. Here's a few examples of things that you could provide input on, and here's a direct link to where you can go on the website. Because when I talk to people about OCP, most of them don't know what it means, and they're not sure about what sort of feedback that they could provide. So having some kind of handout or a postcard that we could give to people, if that's an option.
Through the chair to Councillor O'Keefe, I would be certainly happy to make postcards available to any councillors that are interested in doing that. I guess there is a reality too that some people are just not interested in community planning. And certainly when I was out on Beacon Avenue, I'm not sure if it was COVID or the time of day or what have you, but I would say about 20% of people were willing to sort of stop and talk about community planning generally. So it's an uphill challenge, I think, with whatever group of people you're talking to. But certainly we've tried to make accessing the website fairly accessible with an easy URL that can kind of stick in your brain. But certainly, if there are groups of people that you'd like to pass on the postcard to, I'd be happy to drop some off in your mailbox. Thanks.
Okay. And I was a follow-up, if I may, Madam Chair. I recall that you're talking about having your pizza night, and that involves, I presume, some sort of handout or workbook, and whether those are things that would be useful for us to have as well. if we come across people who might be interested, that we can hand those things out? Is that also an option?
Absolutely, yeah, it is.
Okay. All right, thank you.
I think the struggle is we want to ensure that going through this OCP review that we tap into as great a variety of our community as we can to get as much perspective so that it's reflective of our community. And as has already been noted, the interest and or why it should interest people, that's the hard part. And just saying, you know, do you want to have a say in what Sydney looks like? And that's a pretty big open statement or question unless you know what's being asked of you or have some sort of interest. So I really have a sense that staff have heard council's concerns and are trying their best to do it. You know, it takes two. It takes people on the other side to engage as well, and shouldn't stop us from trying to do as much as we can. But I think there are just going to be realistic limits of what is going to happen. I've got one question on the online, the interactive map. Is that an immediate interaction, or is there a delay of hours or days with that?
I suppose it could be an immediate interaction. The challenge being that the amount of time that planning staff are able to devote to it each week is not a huge amount, probably totaling, you know, an hour between the three of us at the moment. So we do try, and if you start a thread, a discussion in the page, the author of that gets immediately notified. So I've started one on Beacon Avenue, for example, and I get an email as soon as someone responds to that. And I'll try to keep that conversation going as much as possible right away. However, if a resident starts a thread, it's a little more spotty in terms of someone has to reply directly to your comment, I think. So no, it's not instant, but you can have some fairly decent back and forth in a short amount of time.
That was just an interest. I was curious of what the response was.
It's not like a chat program, though. No.
Okay. Yeah. So is there any way of identifying who the individuals are or where they're coming from, or is that fairly anonymous?
They do have to register on the site. I haven't received the list from the site host yet, but some of the people who have been posting, I just know because we see emails from them or something like that. It's pretty clear that they're Sydney residents, and you know, they have specific concerns in most cases or specific ideas about the community. So I'd say from that perspective, it's a success, in that it's a very local and intimately Sydney discussion. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Newcomb. Any further, Councillor O'Keefe? Sorry, Mr. Humble.
Thank you.
Excuse me, Councillor O'Keefe, can we just go to Mr. Humble first?
Oh, sure, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to respond to Councillor O'Keefe's comment about sort of getting a broader understanding of what an OCP is, etc. There was an excellent presentation that actually Corey did to the OCP Advisory Committee. I believe it was the second committee meeting, where he provided really good background and context in terms of Sydney's OCP, really articulating well what an OCP is, etc. And so I think certainly if that could be even broken out and referring people to that particular presentation, because again, I thought it was excellent, and I thought it gave a really good, clear understanding of what an OCP is.
That sounds good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Humble. Councillor O'Keefe, please.
Thank you. That presentation sounds, really, really good. So I'd be interested in, I'll take a look at that. Also, just a question for Mr. Newcomb about the online town hall. So I understand from his comments that has that ended now?
Through the chair to Councillor O'Keefe, yes, it has. It ended last week, I believe.
Okay, because that was that was sort of like a survey, wasn't it? You went through and answered a number of questions, and then there was places to offer comments as well.
It was essentially the boards from the in-person open house reflected in sort of a survey format. So you just worked through them, and each sort of prompt that was on each board at the open house was a question in the survey, essentially.
Right,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, because I think I went through that just to see what it was like, and I thought it was really good. And so I've referred a number of people to that recently, and I didn't realize that it's no longer up there. Is there some other option aside from the interactive thing that you described where they could participate? Or is it possible that we can leave that online town hall up on the website so people can continue to go and make their comments?
We do need to get those comments back to the consultant, just to identify some directions for them to follow going forward. However, and I haven't had a chance to do this yet, but the boards from the open house will be put on the website, and so people can look through them. There's a bit of information on there, some question prompts for them to think about, and obviously the my contact information is immediately next to where those will be. So if they want to email me with specific ideas or go to the ideas map and put their ideas on there, that option is always open to them, essentially.
Okay, good, thank you.
Can I add as well, I think one thing, and I really like the idea about going out to the parks and using signage at the parks. I think one thing we haven't done to date that we are going to need to do is have almost tailored signage. So we're going to need to have a sign in the park that says something that's of interest to young families, and somewhere else we're going to need to have something that's of interest to that area. So we're working on that right now, and hopefully that brings some additional results back. We're doing everything we can. It's a tough slog, though.
Thank you, that sounds encouraging. Seeing no further questions from my colleagues, then I will thank you very much, Mr. Newcomb, for this presentation. Appreciate the update and look forward to what comes next on that. Thank you. And next on our agenda is 9B, proposed amendments to off-street parking and loading bylaw number 2140. And we have a presentation from Corey Newcomb, Senior Manager of Long Range Planning, and a report from October 13th. Mr. Newcomb.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this is an overview of the amendments we're proposing to off-street parking and loading bylaw number 2140. This is just an initial pass, so we are looking for direction and feedback from the committee here prior to bringing a draft bylaw forward to council. So a quick overview of the presentation and a background on some of the points. So the first amendment that's being proposed to the bylaw is in relation to accessible parking. And this came about in late 2018 when the province of British Columbia removed the accessible parking requirement from the BC Building Code, essentially stating that it's a non-building matter, and they would be leaving it to local governments to make regulations with respect to that parking. So we've got a proposal related to accessible parking, and we have been discussing what this will look like with some stakeholders in the community over the last year and a half, essentially. The next item is addressing previous council direction on the payment in lieu provision in the bylaw, and a review of what that looks like and some potential changes to that. The third item is addressing the continued growth of the electrical vehicle market, and primarily it's intended to address some of the challenges faced in multifamily and mixed-use buildings. We've seen some pretty decent uptake on the installation of chargers in purely commercial properties and single-family homes, but it's not quite as simple of a matter in multifamily buildings. So this is intended to address that. Over the last couple of years, we've had some challenges, some fairly minor challenges, but challenges nonetheless related to bicycle parking requirements. So there's a few tweaks in that area, and as well bringing forward a change that was made in the pandemic to outdoor parking and essentially running a cafe in an outdoor parking space, and bring that forward for council to revisit. So in terms of accessible parking, what we've done is add a definition of accessible to the bylaw to make it clear what exactly that is. Brought forward a minimum number and size of required accessible parking spaces, and essentially they're required for any land use in town. They are divided up by residential and all other uses. A bit of an arbitrary thing, but residential tends to have different needs than, say, commercial or industrial. Some signage and marking requirements for accessible parking, and some construction standards, so in terms of surfacing and so on and so forth. So the way we've approached this accessible parking requirement is specifically to address Sydney's unique context in relation to parking. I think unlike probably the majority of municipalities, Sydney is a very, very land constrained and municipality with very small lots. So you might have a land constrained municipality with larger lots, that's a possibility, or you've got a very, large municipality, large lots. We've got sort of the worst of the both worlds in terms of parking. So we've got a town layout from about 100 years ago that predates vehicles, essentially. It's much like Old Town Victoria in terms of, I think, the way it was laid out and the expectations for land use and development. So we really struggle to be able to accommodate parking and every other use that the bylaws require to put on a property. So I think that's the context we've approached this from, and I think unlike, say, a place like the District of Saanich, which is able to fairly easily get quite a few requirements onto lots because they tend to be very large lots in relation to the needs of vehicles, we struggle with that. So I think it's good to go through this list of stakeholder comments, and Council received a letter from Mr. Willows in relation to the bylaw amendments, and just address these point by point, just to illustrate whether or not they're doable in terms of each specific one. So Mr. Willows brought forward the idea of curb ramp locations and making sure those curb ramps are in appropriate places, so that they're not sort of stuck behind a parked car or something like that. That's fairly easy to do. It's a small amendment to the way the current bylaw is worded, or sorry, the current proposed amendments are worded, and likewise with markings maintenance, something that's fairly easy to do. In terms of the markings maintenance, it would be just a clause in the bylaw saying that the markings will be maintained on an ongoing basis. The struggle there is many of these parking spaces are not in visible sight of the street, and going into each building and making sure the markings are maintained isn't a feasible thing. So it would be more sort of a backstop to ensure that if someone came forward with a complaint that the markings are wearing off and I don't know where to park my vehicle anymore in terms of accessible spaces, that we'd be able to go in there and say, okay, the bylaw requires X, and please bring it up to standard. Likewise, the idea in Mr. Willow's letter about exemptions for certain uses like police vehicles is a good one, and I think we could easily add that to the bylaw. And this gets into my comments in terms of Sydney's unique context in relation to parking, where we start to get into difficulties is the proposal to add one accessible space per adaptable housing unit. So as the committee is aware, in multifamily and mixed-use buildings, the town requires 20% of those units be adaptable. The trick here is that not every one of those units is occupied by someone with disabilities in the end. I think probably if half of them are occupied by someone with disabilities, that's probably a high percentage. It's usually sort of one or two in a building. And so to require an accessible parking space for each of those units comes at a very high space cost, especially in the units where those adaptable, especially in the buildings where those adaptable units tend to be located, which is downtown or surrounding downtown, where the lots are quite small and the intensity of land use is quite high. And right now, as proposed, the accessible parking probably comes to about half that level, so we're probably at about 10% of unit. No, I guess it's less because it's about 4% of units. But I guess the base point is that the number of actually used adaptable units by people with disabilities is likely closer to what the requirement for accessible parking is, rather than vice versa. So staff's position on requiring one accessible space for every adaptable housing requirement is that it's probably unnecessary, and the level proposed by the draft bylaw is more appropriate. The final point about strata designations for parking. So the idea here is that there's a clause in the bylaw that says any accessible parking spaces shall be deemed to be common property if a strata plan is adopted for that property. The challenge with that is that the town is not involved at all in the deposit of a strata plan, which essentially sets the strata plan as the legal division for that property. So we could adopt it into the bylaw, and at building permit inspection stage, building permit plan check stage, we could ensure that there's maybe some wording or something like that on the plans that say accessible parking shall be common property. The problem is there's no mechanism to ensure that when the strata plan is deposited, that that's what they're actually doing. And the only way to ensure that that would happen is by requiring a covenant on the title at, say, the approval stage to ensure that that promise is carried and kept to the strata plan deposit stage. The difficulty there is that a covenant requires a discretionary approval, such as a rezoning, so it wouldn't be a consistent requirement through all development types. So we certainly could adopt a clause like that into the bylaw, but the implementation of and requirement for that would be more difficult to enforce, essentially, and may get the town to the position of having to follow up with developers and essentially amend their strata plan, potentially a significant amount of time after the strata plan has been deposited. The developer might not even be there. The strata could be in place. And so the town is now in a position of essentially negotiating with the strata council to bring things back to where they're supposed to be. So it's definitely a logistical difficulty. So we'd appreciate the committee's feedback on some of those aspects. We will be looking at Mr. Willow's proposals in more detail and bringing that forward to a future meeting with further comments. The next item on the amendment list is the payment in lieu provision in the bylaw. So this is resulting out of previous council direction to review this aspect of the bylaw. We currently have a $10,000 per parking space payment requirement in a specified area, essentially the downtown Sydney. Developers can pay $10,000 to reduce their parking space requirement by one. There is currently no cap on the number of spaces that may be paid for in lieu. So we've done a review of first the $10,000 amount, and we found that to be consistent with most other jurisdictions, I would say. There's some higher, some lower, but the average seems to be around $10,000. It's also consistent with our fairly recent historical cost to take that money from the parking reserve where it goes and build public surface parking spaces. I think if memory serves, the 3rd Street parking lot, which was built with money from that that reserve fund, I think it was $9,600 a space or something like that. So it's around $10,000 for, I believe that the two most recent ones would be the employee parking lot and the 3rd Street parking lot. So what we're proposing to change is not the $10,000 amount, but placing a cap on the number of available, possible parking in lieu spaces of 25% of the total number of spaces. So in doing that, we looked at some of the recent developments that were approved with payment in lieu, and the average over, say, it's about the last 4 years was 29%, and you can see they vary from 9% up to 69%. Mostly these 7 projects there have netted the town $836,000 since 2018. And some of that money has been used for the 3rd Street parking lot, the Moto car share program we have in town, a multifamily parking study, and some of it is earmarked for bike lanes on Rest Haven as well. So likewise, would appreciate the committee's feedback on the appropriateness of the 25% and whether the $10,000 is still a suitable amount for the payment in lieu program. The next is electric vehicle charging. So our work here in Sydney basically follows on work done by the District of Saanich primarily, as well as the Capital Region District. Both of those local governments hired a consultant to look at electric vehicle charging in multifamily properties in detail. And the District of Saanich did it first for their own municipality, and then the CRD did a broader look at the region and provided some baseline numbers that municipalities could use to adopt their own EV charging standard. So this amendment includes some defined terms for electric vehicles. And at this time, what we're proposing is that the EV charging standard would be for multifamily units only. And the reason for that is because typically it's the multifamily buildings that have the most difficulty in retroactively bringing in an EV charging system. You've got 1 or 2 people in the building who have just bought an electric car or jazzed about getting a charging system put in, and it's $70,000 to retrofit the building, and the strata isn't willing to bear that cost, and the 2 owners obviously are not willing to bear that cost. So by requiring them in multifamily units up front, that question is sort of answered at the development stage. That's not the case for single family or commercial, where you've got, in most cases, a single owner who can decide to get a system installed, whether to benefit their customers or themselves as the homeowner. And the intent with this standard is to supply power to each parking space, not to supply a charger, just to supply an electrified conduit to each charging space with a minimum performance standard. And the performance standard you can see on the right-hand side there in that table. So where you've got a 20 amp circuit powering the conduit, you can have it up to 2 chargers on the circuit, so 2 parking spaces. And the idea behind that is you provide a minimum level of charging necessary to bring a vehicle up to a minimum commute height overnight. So when someone comes home from their day at work, they plug in, and they know that when they wake up in the morning, their vehicle is going to have enough juice in it to get them to work the next day and home. So that's what that performance standard is intended to require. Because we're not requiring a charger in the bylaw, just an electrified conduit, the user can then decide what they want to do with that electrified conduit. So if they want to install a plug that they can plug their scooter into or their electric bike, they can choose to do that. The important part is getting that electrified conduit in place, connected back to the meters. So it's really a very flexible approach. And as I mentioned, the whole idea here is to ensure a performance standard for EV vehicle charging to make sure that when people come home, they're going to be able to get to work the next day. So second to last proposal for amendment is a few things to do with the bikes. Right now, the bylaw requires a bicycle room to be on the ground floor, directly accessible to the outside. In certain cases, having it underground is just fine, we think, and either providing an elevator, or if there's no elevator in the building, a bike ramp up the stairs to be able to push your bike out. So that's a minor change. The other thing we ran into on a number of developments was that we require that bike racks be weather protected. So Class 2 bike racks are the racks like you see in the picture here outside the building down the street, just the typical metal frame bike racks. And what the bylaw requires is that the rack be weather protected. And the issue we're running into is that in order to weather protect the bike rack, you either need to build a structure in the front yard, which is not permitted by the zoning bylaw, or extend the canopy of the building out beyond what is permitted by the zoning bylaw. So it's not an ideal, it's sort of a conflict with the zoning bylaw, and an outdoor bike rack is really intended for sort of a short-term stay, someone coming over for a few hours or something like that. Residents of the building are going to use the inside bike room, most likely. So it's the weather protection is not as necessary, I think, it's sort of a nice to have, and there would be opportunities to maybe bring that bike rack under the building, but it's been difficult to require that in every case, so making that more flexible. The final amendment, which we're recommending not be changed at this time, but revisited in 12 months, is the temporary change that was made in response to the pandemic to allow businesses to use parking spaces, private parking spaces, for cafe space. So we think that there's likely still a need for businesses to have this flexibility, and if the committee and council is okay with it, we'll bring it back in 12 months and revisit it then. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Newcomb. Does committee have questions for Mr. Newcomb? Comments? Councillor O'Keefe. You're still muted.
There I am. Okay, thank you. Topic is, so the accessible parking. I was just wondering, there's two types of spots, the type A and the type B. So the type A being the bigger one for vans. And I just wondered whether we had thought about just making them all type A spots so that persons in vans didn't have to worry about whether there might be a spot or not. Whether we had thought of that. Did that relate perhaps to your earlier comments about space being an issue?
Yeah, through the chair to Councillor O'Keefe. Yeah, absolutely. It's we're trying to strike a balance between the difficulties of cramming a lot of stuff onto one property, and so we're trying to take sort of a balanced approach to this. I think the reason why staff are comfortable with having the two types of spaces is because we're also requiring the accessible aisle in between the two spaces, or beside the space. So the effective width is actually the type 1 or type 2 plus that accessible aisle beside the space as well. Okay.
And my other, it's I guess just a comment about the adaptable, the parking spaces for adaptable units, and I appreciate your comment about, it seems like it's not people with disabilities who are buying these accessible units. I guess what I struggle with is we don't know what we don't know. So we don't know that our persons with disabilities not buying these units because they don't have any appropriate parking there. And it just seems to me that if we're going to make a commitment to provide adaptable units, I mean, we wouldn't change any of the, we wouldn't consider, say, a variance on the inside of the unit to say, well, we're going to change the the width of the doorways, because, you know, we don't think that there's very many people with disabilities who are going to buy this unit anyways. So to me, I kind of look at it as a package deal. If we're going to make the commitment to an adaptable unit, then we should provide parking for that as well. So that's my initial sort of reaction to that. So I'd like us to, the rest of council, to be pondering that as well.
Sorry, Councillor O'Keefe, if I might just, I should probably clarify my comments.
Okay.
What I hope came across is not that people with disabilities are not buying these units.
Right.
I think the idea is that the intent was never that every single adaptable unit in a building that gets built will be occupied by people with disabilities. The idea behind the 20% is to build enough of these units into a building that if someone does come along, or two people come along who do require an adaptable unit in the building, that one of those units might be available amongst the 6 in the building for them to occupy. So the idea, and again, the idea is not that they're all occupied by someone who requires them. The idea is that there's a stock of those type of units out there that will potentially be available for someone who needs it to be able to occupy. And so, you know, if we accept the fact that we're building a lot of them, but 10% of them are only ever going to be occupied by someone who needs that special type of unit, I think what staff are saying is that the number of accessible spaces should go along with that actual number of units that we expect to be occupied, not every single unit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I'll have to ponder that more to if I agree with that.
Well, I mean, I think everyone can agree that probably 20% of the occupants in a multifamily building probably don't require all the features of an adaptable unit.
Right.
So it's more about providing that stock of units. In the same way we're requiring 10% of the units be 3 bedrooms or more, we're requiring that stock be built into the buildings with the idea that someday someone might come along who might need that type of unit. Not that all of them are going to be immediately occupied by that type of person who we're shooting for right off the bat.
Right. Okay, well, thanks. I'll ponder that and more think that. That's all for me for now.
Thank you. Anybody else have questions for Mr. Newcomb? Sorry, Councillor Rintoul. I always look away when you put your hand up. Sorry.
Earned my life, Madam Chair. Thank you. My question will be with respect to the second item, Mr. Newcomb, and that's payment in lieu. And so I guess for starters, my concern around providing the option of 25% of the number of spaces remain eligible for parking in lieu is in part that I feel like we're pushing this problem onto the street. I don't know that we're pushing people out of cars. I think we're pushing people to park in already limited on-street parking areas. And if you look at the number of projects that you've cited here and how many of these are currently built out, a number of them are not, including certainly the bottom 3, and the Bevan may be built but still selling, even the Quartet's still selling for that matter. So I don't think we've seen the full extent of what's been created here in terms of an on-street parking challenge as these units sell. And I think we're insulated from it. Frankly, the pandemic in a way has perhaps, at least during a period, limited some of the parking challenges and stress that we felt we were feeling, particularly during the summer months when we see increased visitor traffic and shoppers frequenting the retail environment here in Sydney. So I remain a little concerned that 25 may be high, and I'll leave that comment. I'll also speak to the suggestion that we don't change the $10,000. And you'd indicated in the staff report that recent surface parking space installations in Sydney were used to sort of reconfirm that $10,000 value. Through the chair to staff, does that $10,000 include either the lease or procurement of land, or is that just laying down the asphalt?
Through the chair to Councillor Rintoul, no, that's just the physical construction of the parking spaces. It doesn't include land costs.
Yeah. So I think that's the challenge for us when we look at this and we look at the creation of using these funds for parking. Yeah, we might be able to resurface a parking lot with the funds we're collecting. We might be able to repaint the lines to squeeze a few more vehicles in, but we're not addressing even in the immediate term whatever challenges we feel there may be around parking. And so my second comment would be that $10,000 figure is probably too light as well. So I'll leave my comments there. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Rintoul. Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Having one of those nights when I agree with Councillor Rintoul, those are 2 points actually I was going to bring up, so I just want to echo what he had stated. Also, referring to the accessible parking spaces, and I'm wondering, the 1 to 9 doesn't provide any spaces at all, and I guess I have a little bit of concern over that given the demographic of our population, and thinking we might have a 9-unit building where there isn't any spaces for somebody who needs an accessible parking space. And I'm wondering if that's something you're going to stick to, or is that something we can jiggle with to just try and sort of foresee any difficulty that might arise out of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that could be changed. Typically, in the smaller buildings like that, what we've seen is there's generally space where the architect will design it such that they use, so when you line up the width of parking spaces in a building, they almost never exactly match the width of the property or the width of the building that you're building them into. And so there's quite, especially the smaller you get, there's a larger leftover portion. And what's happened in the past is architects have used that leftover portion and just made an accessible space where one is actually not required. So that's been quite a common thing. That being the case, I think, yeah, certainly possible to change, maybe make a 1 space minimum or something like that. I guess the difficulties would be in, say, a 3-unit townhouse or something like that, where how would you incorporate 1 accessible space into a 3-unit
Right.
building? Again, you run into that issue where there's a need to allocate that space to a certain type of individual,
Right.
but the mechanism to do that is very difficult to come by. So, yeah, I mean, zoning bylaws, parking bylaws, none of them ever address a perfect situation and provide a perfect set of circumstances for a building. That's why the variance process exists, to be able to tweak them a bit. But yeah, I mean, if that's a concern of council, we can certainly look at bringing that down a little bit.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Anybody else?
I'm sure,
Mr.
if I may,
Newcomb,
just two anecdotes, sorry, that do illustrate, I guess, that the the need for parking is not always there. So as an example, the 2211 James White Boulevard project, the Painted Ladies, is nearing completion. It's just been occupied, and I've been on site a number of times, sort of checking on its progress. And I've had the chance to talk to a couple of people who have just moved in there. And the first person I talked to was a woman about my age, had just moved in and into a unit and works in downtown Sydney in the service industry. And I said, how, can I ask, are you driving, or what, what's happening? And she said, I don't drive. I never have driven. I moved into this building precisely because I can walk to work, and I don't need to pay that extra cost for parking. So those people are out there. And they choose to live in those types of units typically because it saves them costs in terms of, a lot of buildings charge extra for parking, right? And what I've seen in my, say, decade-long career in Sydney is that there are about 20% of people in a building who might fit that category. It varies from building to building. Between the senior population, between a younger demographic, there are some people in the building who don't need a parking space. And I think partially the payment in lieu program is intended to reflect that reality. On the flip side of that, you have people who will move into a building with one parking space, into a unit that has one parking space, and they'll have 3 cars. And we've had people living in downtown who have tried to accommodate their 3 cars by sort of doing this daily movement of their vehicles around and around. And it typically lasts about 2 months, and then they move on because they've got so many parking tickets that they can't handle it anymore. And so I guess the point I'm trying to illustrate there is that people will choose the unit by the services it provides to them. And if they don't need that service, they'll choose a unit that doesn't provide it. If they need a service that the unit doesn't provide, aka parking, they typically won't last long in that unit because of the lack of, they'll either find a solution that works, like paying for off-site parking, or they'll move on. And that's a reality, I think, in any community, and partially the reason why the payment in lieu program exists. So,
Thank you, Mr. Newcomb. Councillor Rintoul.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So I recognize that was somewhat anecdotal, but I do appreciate your experience in this area, having worked for a number of years and dealt with this. Even in your example, Mr. Newcomb, you said, approximately 20% of people, this scenario fits where, they don't need a parking spot. And if that's the case, then, the option shouldn't be for 25%. In the proposal here, changes to the bylaws should be for 20%. I don't want to get into anecdotal stories back and forth. Again, I appreciate what you've said. I feel that there's an opportunity here to address this with some minor modifications. And I appreciate that staff have put, the suggestion of 25% in. But again, even in your own experience, it sounds like 20% would be more viable. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Rintoul. Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. I'll just weigh in as well on the pay in lieu. I agree with Councillor Rintoul here and Councillor Garnett. I think the 25% is too high and the 10K is too low. I don't think that this is being used, as Councillor Rintoul says, to get people out of their cars. It's more a way for, the construction industry to reduce costs, and I guess in a way that's a good thing because it would also reduce the cost for people there. But it does have an impact on our businesses in the downtown core, and I agree that we haven't seen the extent of how all of these other condos that are being built in the downtown core are going to impact our housing, our parking. So I'm inclined to look at a lower cap and a higher charge as well. One other comment just on the going back to the accessible parking again, and staff's comment about the difficulty making a requirement for stratas to make that common property. I guess what I'd be interested to know more about is other jurisdictions have done this. Other jurisdictions have also made parking spaces for each adaptable unit, and they seem to think it was a good idea. So I'd be interested if in the future, if there was more information about how other local governments are able to make that work for them. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And next is Councillor Wainwright.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to comment on the payment in lieu, and I appreciate the comments that my colleagues are making about the 25% cap probably being too high, and a concern about the 10,000 charge potentially being too low. So the one thing about to keep in mind about the parking bylaw is that the council of the day can grant variances to any of these items. So in the past, Sydney actually had a payment in lieu charge that was significantly more than the 10,000. It was high enough that it was actually a disincentive to developers to want to pay in lieu. And as a consequence of that, they requested variances instead of payment in lieu. And it got to the point where council was routinely providing variances instead of requiring payment in lieu. So I just would suggest we want to keep it in mind that if we set the rate too high, we may actually be creating a situation for future councils to grant variances rather than take the money. So I am reluctant to support a significant increase in that 10,000. And I think a small tweak probably isn't going to do what my colleagues are looking for. With respect to the proposed cap, I would be fine with the proposal to reduce it to 20%. The comment here is that if there is a legitimate case where we think that 20% cap is a hardship, it's actually reasonably easy to give them a variance and allow them to pay for a larger number. So I think in terms of starting a starting number for the bylaw, I'm comfortable picking 20% because if we find through experience that that number is a bit too low, we can grant a variance on a case-by-case basis. And if we're having to do it a lot, we can amend the bylaw accordingly based on that experience. But I'm quite comfortable going with the 20%. The thing I'm not comfortable with is a significant increase in the payment of lieu fee. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wainwright. Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Mr. Newcomb, for the report and detailed presentation. A number of areas I'd wish to cover. My first is with regards to accessible parking. Thank you very much. It's very impressive, these changes that can be brought to the bylaw. There's been a lot of consideration, and I think it will be an improvement. The only question I have, subject to hearing the discussion, is in terms of 20%. And I realize this is not a parking and loading bylaw question. But in terms of the 20% being accessible units, is that pretty much consistent around the region?
Through the chair to Mayor McNeil-Smith, Sydney actually has a fairly custom and unique adaptable dwelling unit requirement. District of Saanich, for example, uses the accessible unit requirement in the BC Building Code. My understanding is that 15, 20 years ago, Sydney developed its own adaptable dwelling unit requirement and put it into the zoning bylaw, and it's been in there ever since. And I believe the 20% has been in there as well. And the difference between Sydney's and a number of other municipalities that use, say, the BC Building Code requirement is that the adaptable units don't need to be built as an accessible unit. They are required to have a floor plan that provides the potential to adapt them to someone who needs that type of unit. So they're not immediately accessible. They need some modifications to make them as such. And I believe the District of Saanich, for example, in some cases requires 100% of the units to have that accessible standard from the building code. but it's not as extensive as what the adaptable unit requirement in Sydney requires. So it's not really an apples to apples comparison. The major difference with Sydney's is that it requires quite a bit of a larger floor plan in order to better accommodate wheelchairs, essentially.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Again, I would be in favor of there being, as many units as possible, reasonable to have the accessible parking if they're accessible units, but not necessarily suggesting it be one-to-one. Very satisfied with the accessible parking provisions. With regards to payment in lieu, I don't want to repeat all the comments, but it is a situation, while we've seen a chart provided tonight with a number of projects that had payment in lieu, during the same 3 or 4 year period when there was no limit on payment in lieu in terms of percentage, and no cap on payment in lieu, and it was $10,000. There were a number of variances given. So even with no limit on payment in lieu and $10,000, there was significant variances given on a number of projects. So having seen that, I would be in favor of trying to choose the appropriate limit on payment in lieu, and similarly with regards to the amount charged per space. And so I guess I would be comfortable with 20% to start. Again, I was on council earlier when, or in a previous term when when it went from $10,000 to $20,000. We've heard comments on some historical in terms of some of the things that happened. However, the reality is that $10,000 is not going to build a parking space other than providing the asphalt and lines on land that the town already owns or is able to lease at a nominal rate, and certainly not be able to ever build a parkade with that. And the other thing is that the developer, the cost of them building an underground parking space is far in excess of $10,000. And if they don't build the parking space, what the revenue that they are able to get for that space is far in excess of $10,000. So I'm actually in favor of it increasing it. I'm not suggesting it go back to 20,000. I appreciate what the conversations that have, or the discussions and the policy that's been put in place in municipalities around the region that have gone. Some have had higher and gone back to 10,000 as Sydney has, but I would like to reconsider that being increased. Very impressed with the comprehensive EV charging equipment requirements that are suggested as amendments to the bylaw. I think that brings us into 220 and beyond, and the other amendments with regards to the bicycle and so on. With regards to the outdoor seating, so it was, as I think it's indicated in the report, that was going to come back to council in 6 months. My recommendation or my suggestion to colleagues and staff is that given the nature of the pandemic and the horizon that we're looking at now, is that that we actually leave that in place until possibly the fall of 2021. And so those are the items that were brought forward in the staff report. I do have a couple of other questions. And one of them is with regards to section 4, which is the calculation of parking and loading requirements. And so it indicates that, and there is a chart under 411 that indicates the number of parking spaces that are, and now we're talking about commercial space, the number of parking spaces that are required based on the type of commercial use. And We've had a number of mixed-use developments come forward, and have been some have been completed and some are under construction. And as it indicates in the bylaw, that in the case of different uses located on the same lot, the total parking and loading space requirement shall be the sum of the requirements of the various uses computed separately. So a common example is there is residential space, and I can think of one particular building that had 35 condos, and so it was 35 parking spaces, 1-to-1 for the residential. And given the 4,800 square feet that was going to be for the commercial space, 80% of that goes into the calculation, and that determined there had to be 9 spaces. So a total of 44 spaces. They chose to request and receive a variance of 4 spaces, but the bylaw doesn't speak to what those spaces actually get used for in the development. And in a mixed-use development, you will have residents, you will have visitors to the residence, you will have services to the residents. So, somebody comes to hook up cable or phone or internet or what have you, deliver a fridge, those sorts of things. And then the commercial space will have patrons, it will have employees, and again, it will have often deliveries, depending on the type of business it is. But after the calculation is done at 44 spaces, it doesn't say what those spaces have to be used for. And in some cases, garage doors are being put onto these buildings, and so there are not going to be any patrons parking in those spaces. There aren't going to be deliveries made to the loading zone that's inside the garage door, and there will be no visitors. So if you take the Landmark building, for example, it does allocate space for the different types of uses. That is residents, visitors, commercial employee parking, and patron parking. Yet we don't. That's not. There's no language to that, and it's not specified. And I would ask staff to consider, subject to consideration by colleagues, to give that consideration and bring options forward to consider, because the intent of the park, and I just look, for example, it says childcare facility, 1 space per 5 children. Well, I don't know if that's actually what's needed, and we could amend the bylaw to reflect what's actually needed. But we have a childcare facility that has no, it's not up to its full capacity because of COVID, but it has room for some 75 children. And it has no parking spaces, dedicated to the childcare use. Again, there's an opportunity that a restaurant could go into one of these developments. Well, there's 4 developments. 2 of them are 5 stories, and 2 of them are 6 stories. They all have underground parking. The smallest is going to have nearly 5,000 square foot of retail. The largest is going to have between 15,000 and 20,000 square foot of retail, and they're likely not going to have any parking spaces for patrons. They might be able to allocate some for employees, but again, in some of those projects there was variance granted, and not likely. So I'll leave that for staff to consider, or for my colleagues to comment on as well. The next part that I wanted to touch on was a small piece, and I just have to find the page here. So it's in section 4.5, and number 1, it says, if sufficient parking spaces cannot be provided on the same lot, required parking spaces may be located on another lot within 30 meters of the building that the space is intended to serve. And then the next paragraph speaks to there actually being an agreement in place, and that sort of thing. Are there any examples of that in the downtown commercial core that you can be aware of? I certainly know of situations where a particular commercial owner had surface space, and I think of the old Theo's had an additional lot, and a legal firm that had 10 employees, used to have their space. I don't know that there was agreement in place because both buildings went back decades and decades. But can you think of examples where there are agreements in place?
Through the chair to Mayor McNeil-Smith, no, I can't. None spring to mind, and I don't believe I've come across any in my time in Sydney.
It doesn't sound particularly practical to me for the long term. So in the event, and let's just say in that event when Theo's had that additional parking space, there was about 18 parking spaces there. And he could have signed an agreement and that sort of thing. Well, today that property has been redeveloped. And so the agreement, there's no guarantee that the agreement could be anywhere into the long-term future. So if there's no present examples, and I don't see it being particularly practical in the future, I'd be happy with that being removed, unless staff have a reason for wanting to keep it in the bylaw.
I do think there's, I mean, it's probably a small possibility, but for example, if a property owner has two, say, adjacent properties and wants to utilize the second property to provide parking for the first, and doesn't necessarily want to amalgamate those properties or cannot amalgamate those properties for, maybe they're very close but not specifically connected, and a property I'm thinking of, say, there's one in the downtown right beside the old post office building that has its parking in behind. It's a small 2-story building. I think Walking Comfort used to be in there. They use, I'm not sure if they have an agreement or not, but they use the lot in behind as a connected parking space. And so if they wanted to, say, I don't know, add a story to their building or something like that, they may have enough surplus parking on that adjacent lot to provide that, and we would require that in order to issue them a development permit and building permit. So I would say the possibility to use that provision in the bylaw is there, rare as it might be. And there are, particularly because Sydney does have some sort of unique property configurations in a very small, tight downtown. Yeah, I mean, there might be a situation where that may come in handy in terms of a property owner wanting to do something incremental with their property and being able to accommodate that on an adjacent lot.
Okay, thank you for that. The last is, and I'm sorry,
if I can, Madam
Just,
Chair,
yes, please, Mr. Humble.
Just to speak to that question, I think historically, I think in the past 20 years, I think it's been utilized once in the past 20 years, and I don't believe the agreement is still in place, but I can think of one time when it was used in the past 20-some years, in my time here.
Thank you, Mr. Humble.
Thank you.
okay. I just think the nature of our downtown and the small lots, having owned a commercial property and different business licenses, but I'll leave it to staff to consider, and thank you for the answers to that. So I just can't find the location, but there is a place in the bylaw where it describes 3 different bicycle parking spaces. And I'm wondering if you could just direct me to that.
I'm sorry, 3 different types of bicycle parking spaces?
Yeah, there's a protected one, then there's a bicycle rack, and then there's, I think it's just called a bicycle space.
Section 5, is it section 5? Bicycle parking requirements, second last page.
Sorry, what number?
Second last page.
So there's class 1 and class 2 bicycle parking standards and requirements for each of those standards.
At any rate, I believe the third one just said bicycle space. So I understand what a protected bicycle shelter is. I understand what a bicycle stand is, or a bicycle rack is. But what is a bicycle space?
In the context of class 1, which is a bicycle room, it would be a rack essentially on the wall. And in the context of class 2, which is an outdoor rack, it would be one spot within that rack. So for example, when in the section 5.6 in the required class 2 bicycle parking spaces, where it says 6 per building, that is a double-sided 3-space rack. So you can stick 3 bikes into the rack on one side and 3 bikes into the rack on the other side.
Okay, so this has no outdoor implication.
Sorry?
This would have no, the bicycle space would have no outdoor implication.
No, not specifically.
Okay.
No. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Newcomb. Thank you, Chair. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mayor McNeil-Smith. Do we have any other Councillor O'Keefe?
Thank you. Just a couple questions. So, the mayor is making me think about these the issues. Say, for example, of the mixed-use buildings, and then also Councillor Wainwright previously talked about possibly change in use. If a building is a hotel, then it goes to a residence, and I guess I'm trying to clarify or understand better the parking requirements when somebody gets a business license. Is it not part of the business license process that they have to have parking? And I guess, whether they own the building or not. And I'm just wondering, how did we come to a situation where we have a daycare center that requires a lot of parking, but they don't have enough spaces? I just need to understand that a little bit better.
I guess in relation to the, I'm sorry, through the chair to Councillor O'Keefe, in relation to the daycare, I would need to know which daycare is being referred to relate why it doesn't have those spaces. Is it the Aranza building? Yeah.
Yeah, I believe so.
I believe the previous council gave that building a variance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I guess a general comment on Mayor McNeil-Smith's comments on parking spaces is that you'll notice that where buildings are able to provide those separate outdoor business parking spaces or separate outdoor visitor spaces, they're typically larger lots or legacy lots from a long time past. So the Landmark building has because it's essentially an entire block, it has the available space in relation to the size needs of a car to be able to provide those parking spaces. Once you get down to some of the more recent developments where you're literally looking at 1,000 square meters or 10,000 square feet, 12,000 square feet, you get to the point where a vehicle is essentially too big to be accommodated in multiple ways on that lot. And so you get into this position where essentially you can provide an underground parkade, but it's very difficult to provide an underground parkade plus access to an above ground parking space for visitors or something like that. So the smaller the lot gets, the more difficult it is to provide multiple functionalities in relation to an automobile. The only recent building that I can think of that was able to provide some surface spaces as well as an underground parkade is the one at 4th and Beacon, where you've got, I think it's an 18,000 foot lot. So once you get to that size, you start to get to the point where you can provide those multiple functionalities. And so Sydney's challenge is that some of the lots, like the ones with 9 parking spaces on them, they're only 6,000 square feet. So essentially all you can do with a lot like that is drive straight into a couple straight in parking spaces and drive straight out. There's very little room to maneuver. The ground floor of the lot in that case is entirely taken up with vehicle parking and maneuvering, and you end up with this tiny little commercial unit at the front. So the bigger you get, the bigger the lot gets, the more easily you can provide those multiple sort of visitor. And I think the challenge is that our current bylaw is written from the perspective of 25 years ago, 30 years ago, where lots were large enough. You could assemble lots like the Landmark building to be able to do that kind of thing. The cost of land today is such that that's a very small proportion of the development that takes place in Sydney. And I think in that respect, our bylaw has not caught up with the development of realities. And what you see is variances and payment in lieu, where developers are trying to match those development realities to what they're facing out there, and you've got a bylaw that's was really structured on a completely different type of development. So longer term, I would say, Sydney does need to look at, what are we doing with active transportation? What are we doing with vehicle parking? What are we doing with transportation as a whole? And how can we revamp our parking bylaw to take all those things into account, to provide a path forward that works for Sydney's development realities, Sydney's businesses' needs in terms of parking. But I would say that bylaw amendment is not this bylaw amendment. The intent of this bylaw amendment is to address some specific things, and specifically EV parking and accessible parking were the major ones, and I think move forward from there. I do think there's a need to address those types of things in a bigger perspective, potentially with a new parking bylaw that incorporates the realities of our upcoming transportation plan policy in the OCP. But I don't think we're there at this stage to address those bigger issues.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you for that.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you.
Mayor
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for those comments. My comment is going to be, and we're in an OCP process now, so there can be more conversation as we go through the OCP. But I would suggest that given we have in the neighborhood of 200 condos being built in 5 and 6 stories in 4 developments that have between 5,000 and 15,000 plus square feet of commercial on the ground floor, that not giving consideration to residents, visitors, patrons, and employees is not something to be considered a number of years from now. It was something to be considered 5 years ago, because the downtown commercial district with some 400 business licenses at its peak had very little, and in some blocks 0 residential above it. And I'm certainly in favor of densification. I went back to the Town Talk special edition on parking that was done in February of 2018, and there was a map on there, and I remember seeing the same map during the OCP review in 2007, where some 60% or 70% of our downtown is surface parking lot. And so what we've seen through these developments is you're seeing surface parking lots converted into primarily residential use, ground floor residential parking, and sometimes a small amount of commercial space is kept. But then with the density on the upper floors, you're introducing the residential use, and that's a good thing for the community for a number of reasons. But with residents themselves parking on the street, with visitors to residents parking on the street, it is less space for patrons to park on the street. And there's an implication to that. I'm all in favor of improving active transportation. I don't want to turn people away. You want to give them an option rather than having to provide them with a parking space. But to date, we haven't moved forward in terms of active transportation. The last council meeting, I made reference to a 2-year process with the CRD and the province in terms of the South Island multimodal transportation strategy. And the outcome of it is there's not really going to be any more multimodal on the peninsula or throughout Greater Victoria until we restart those talks with the next government. So I'll leave my comments there. I do appreciate the response.
Thank you for your comments, Mayor McNeil-Smith. And Mr. Newcomb, you did touch on things that I was looking at, and active transportation isn't. We have a high competition now for surface parking. We see it right now with our parking spots that have been converted to patio space. And our community is evolving, and not just our own community, but the larger community around us. And we don't have perhaps the transit that we require to accommodate our reduced parking asks. And there has to be that part of it in the equation. It's great to cut back on parking spots and say, we want to encourage people to use different forms of transportation. But they still need to have the transition, and to do that transition, we need to have parking someplace else, we need to have active transportation options, and we need to have transit. That's the only way we're going to bridge that gap effectively. We can, anyhow, that's another conversation. I would support going, increasing the $10,000 for payment in lieu. I think that could be done. I think the 25% for the cap, I would agree with as well. And I think the changes that we're looking at here for the accessible parking spots, I'm happy with. I think those are good ones. So does anybody, Councillor Wainwright, yes. Sorry, did you have your hand up, Councillor Wainwright?
Sorry, no, I didn't.
Okay, sorry. Are there any other comments from council? Seeing none, then we have a recommendation, and I will leave it up to council to move us to the next step, please.
I'll move the recommendation that the staff report be received for information, and that a bylaw to amend bylaw number 2140 be brought forward for council's consideration.
Second? Do we have a seconder?
I'll second that.
Thank you. Any more discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Motion carries. Thank you very much, Mr. Newcomb. Mayor McNeil-Smith, yes.
Thank you, Chair. I have a motion arising from the staff report in our discussion, and that's with regards to the outdoor seating in off-street parking spaces. And there was language here at the end of the report. If there is still a desire among council for this allowance to be short-term, council
Yes.
could consider making a resolution directing staff to bring back the bylaws. So I so move that staff bring back that bylaw, portion of the bylaw, back in October of 2021.
Do we have a seconder?
Second.
Thank you. Any more discussion? Seeing none, call the question. All in favor? Motion carries. Thank you. And at that, we have nothing else on the agenda, and we don't have an in-camera, so I will seek adjournment.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? We are adjourned for the Committee of the Whole.